All set up right. So we don't have a song from Pell today. She's taking a little bit of a break, which is well deserved. We really appreciate your efforts putting the songs together so far. Getting something ready every week can be a lot of work. So it's been nice to have, but we don't have a song for today. Instead, I wanted to pick a topic to talk about and talk about something that's been on my mind on and off for a little bit, and that's solitude. So I'll start with Blaise Pascal. I think he's probably got, to my mind, one of the most famous quotes about solitude. He says, all of man's problems stem from his inability to sit quietly in a room with his thoughts. What Pascal, of course, has in mind is this is where we get into wars and conflicts and all sorts of things. If we could just sit quietly in a room with our thoughts, we wouldn't have nearly so many troubles. So as life starts to return to normal for us educators, while we're starting to get out a little more and connect, I thought it'd be a good time to think about what COVID-19 has done to our lives, and particularly in terms of giving us an opportunity to appreciate solitude, maybe in some healthy ways, maybe in some unhealthy ways. That's something we can talk about. What is that line between those two? Solitude, of course, has a definitional problem. It sounds like it'd be something easy, right? It's when you're alone, but somebody can be alone in a crowd, right? You can imagine being, I don't know, 19 and moving to New York City or something like that, and always being around people. They're everywhere, but still being lonely, still feeling like you are alone, even though everybody's right there. In fact, constant contact with people that you don't know well or strangers, right? These kinds of quick things can make this feeling of being alone worse. So it's not simply that there's nobody around. By the same token, you can be physically distanced from people, but still be quite close. These days, we have lots of ways to stay in contact, whether it's Zoom or anything else, right? So even though you don't see them, you could talk to them every single day. You could share conversations. You could think about them a lot. Even without that contact, you could still be close to people who are far away, who aren't physically in your presence, thinking about them, working with them, dealing with them a lot in one way or another. So it's not simply, is there somebody in the room with you or not? Solitude, we can't define that easily. So I want to start with the kind of noise that is so common in social life and kind of think about what happens if we start to peel some of that away. A lot of our social life involves being what others want us to be. Jean-Paul Sartre uses the example of a waiter who's running around at the various Paris cafes, right, where he's doing his job. And at every step, right, everything that he's doing is being a waiter. It's easy, it's quick, it's natural in a sense to this person, but it's also an act, right? Their entire job in this situation is to be what other people want them to be, to bring them the food others want, to be witty in just the way others want them to be witty, to only have the needs and desires, right, of a waiter. Of course, as a person, he transcends that. He steps out beyond that. He's more than a waiter. He has ideas, thoughts, feelings, whatever, that go beyond it. But in that role, right, he just needs to be what others want to be. And I should know, anybody who's worked with the public and worked these kinds of jobs, that can actually be kind of pleasant. It can be kind of a relief, right? There's a script for how to interact. You know how to do it. You can pass the time quickly and comfortably and easily in a job, interacting with the public, in part because you are present. You don't bring all of yourself there. You know exactly what you're supposed to do. But sometimes you try to step out of it. Sometimes you want to do a little more. Sometimes there's a need for you to not be exactly what others want you to be. You need to find your voice in a sense, right? You need others to hear you. Thinking about that idea, a quote from Paul Farmer always comes to mind, which was, he says, when talking about trying to speak for the voiceless or raise the voices of the voiceless, he says, they've always had a voice, we just didn't listen. And that's really what we're talking about when we say have a voice, right? It's not that you need to be able to have a voice, you have it. You need to be able to be heard. You need others to listen to you, to take you seriously, and not just have you be whatever it is they need you to be. And there can be all sorts of reasons that you might not be heard, right? That you might not have a voice. Children have this experience a lot. I think this is one of the things teenagers go through, is trying to be heard and being seen as a young child and therefore not being heard. Women often don't have a voice, right? They're not heard because they're women. It's difficult for them to be heard. A lot of discussion we've seen recently around Joe Biden's possible vice presidential picks about whether those women are too ambitious, right? They have too much of their own ideas. The kinds of things that has not been said about the men. Racial minorities might experience it. Elderly people experience it. So you got the children on one hand and being old on the other, where they don't get heard. Foreigners might hear it. It can be painful to not be seen, right? To not be respected in that way. So you can be alone in a crowd, right? If you're not heard for yourself. But why? Why is that important? Why do we need others to see us, to hear us, to recognize what we're saying? Not just to be servants, right, and just do what we need to do, but to hear us, to recognize what we're saying. Well, this can be healthy. I don't think it's necessarily unhealthy to have this need. Other people can be a mirror for us that help us grow. So if we think about children, you can see this kind of thing happening. When a small child runs and falls down and hits the ground, we all know that look when the child looks up first to its parents to say, is this something that I scream about, right? Trying to get some kind of feedback from them about what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to behave. Or you can think of a child playing with a cat and giving a good hard pull on the cat's tail and its mother being, horrified, saying, oh no, that's so hurt, don't do that. The child gets a chance to see itself through somebody else's eyes and shape a sense of who he is. And just because children need that means we don't stop as we get older. There's a kind of mirror for us to help us see ourselves, to help us see the way that we're acting, the way we're behaving, to understand ourselves from another perspective can give us a little more depth. So when you're not seen, right, it feels like you're not there at all. But of course, as we get older, we can recognize that how other people see us, the mirror that they offer us, can often reflect as much their own needs as us. That is, it can reflect their own situation, their own background, their own experience. They aren't faithful mirrors that simply show us as we are. They take us and filter us right through their needs and their desires and their lives and their situations. You learn to filter a little bit, right? You learn who you listen to. You learn what you listen to different people about. You know how to take, right, the perceptions that you get, but it's hard. That's a lot of work to sort of have yourself filtered through other people and trying to see yourself through all of that noise. And that might be, right, why we need to be alone. We've got all of that feedback, other people wanting us to be things, other people reflecting us back, but inaccurately or, messed through their positions, their ideas, their backgrounds, their experiences. We might sometimes just want to be alone with ourselves. Of course, anyone who's tried this, anyone who's tried any kind of meditation, any kind of stopping on your own and try to think, knows that one of the first things that happens when you get alone is that the voices of other people are still there. Like, you still continue that conversation you were having with somebody. They're just not part of it anymore. You still think about how those people would see you or respond to you, or what you would say to them if they could see you now. We've internalized those voices, right? They're part of us in a way. We've oriented ourselves towards those voices. We still talk with them, right? Even when they're not there. So in a way, we're still not alone, right? Our lives are still filtered through what we think they would think of us. Depending on sort of how you're doing and where you're at, being alone can be a time that your fears come out, right? That you focus perhaps on the negative, on the things that you're afraid of, on the criticisms that really bother you. You stick with them and keep focusing on them and keep dealing with those things. That is, being alone could be worse than being with others. It could be worse than being sort of the waiter where you know what's expected of you. Your mind can run off in its own directions, thinking about what others would think or say. I wondered why we would do that. Like, why would we talk to others in our heads when we could talk to ourselves? Why, especially why would we do that when it's painful? Why would we focus on, trying to respond to a criticism or the thing we should have said, when we could use solitude to find ourselves, right? To try to hear our own voices and who we are. I think part of the story there is a certain kind of anxiety that underlies being alone. When we're in solitude, we don't have anybody to reflect back to us who we are. We don't have anybody telling us who they need us to be. We can get a certain kind of anxiety. Soren Kierkegaard focused heavily on this kind of anxiety, that we won't find anything at all. That is, without me being something for somebody else, that I'm nothing, that there's nobody there. And it's kind of weird, right? When we talk about, somebody needs to find themselves, they need to find who they are. It's a weird kind of metaphor, as though it's hidden in some sort of drawer or, stuck in the back of a shoebox somewhere. And it can't be like that. You can't just stop and think and say, here I am. This is who I am. Because you always go beyond yourself. That is to say, you always have more choices. You could always do things differently tomorrow. You could always build more out the next day. You could always behave differently. So even if at some point you find something that suits you, that fits you, that you like at that moment, you may not later. So you're not going to find yourself in the sense of finding this permanent, definite thing. And so it can be easier to say, be that waiter and be who they want you to be, right? Then that tells you what you're supposed to do. Being alone can create anxiety because nobody's there to tell you how to be. And maybe there isn't anybody there to tell you how to be. This is the first August in, about 5 years that I haven't been in Paris with my students. And when I take my students to Paris, we go to class all day, we do different things like that. But then at night, I'm alone. I'm not traveling with my wife. I'm not really traveling with anybody else. I'm in different places. And I have one of those experiences that always, to me, highlights solitude. And that's dining out by yourself. When you go to a restaurant and you sit down and there's nobody there for you to talk to, nobody that you're with. The waiter comes and goes and you know how to interact, but sometimes you almost feel like you need to justify yourself. Like, why am I here by myself? Why am I not here with anybody else? And at first, there's a lot of that conversation in my head. But after a while, a day or two of dining alone, those words just stop. I stop having those conversations. I don't continue to carry them out in my own head. I learned to be alone with my thoughts while out in public, to just sit there and have dinner and think about it. It's a good time to rediscover a value that I think our culture has lost. Aristotle in his Ethics is famous for arguing about, sort of how action and social life is where everything happens, until we get to the last book. And then there's this weird swerve. And he says, well, actually, a better life is not a political life and not a social life. The best life is the life of contemplation. And that's not something we think about as a value that much these days. We often think about doing, going out and getting something done, and building something, and creating something, and making something, all of those kinds of things. Contemplation is a different kind of activity. If we're just going to sit out there and say, contemplate the universe, what are we talking about doing? I mean, it's talking about learning about it, right? Thinking about how big it actually is, how old it actually is, all of the different planets and stars and gases and different things that are in it. And we could just think about it, be aware of it, just understand it. We say, well, why are you doing that? For no reason at all, right? I mean, there's no additional effort needs to be made. In the medieval era, monks would go into retreat in order to contemplate God. This is what St. Thomas Aquinas thought heaven would be. What are you going to do in heaven, right? What kind of activities are there going to be? And he thinks you would contemplate God as you just sit there and think, right? And be aware of God in this situation. So it was a certain kind of value that I don't see a lot in our culture anymore. we don't necessarily value contemplation. But being alone can give us that opportunity. Once we get past the voices of other people, once we get past the worries about who and what we are supposed to be, we can stop and just think about the universe or the flowers that we're seeing or anything, right, that is in front of us for its own sake. It can help me recognize that in a way I'm not justified in behaving the way that I am, and I don't need to be justified in behaving that way. I don't need an explanation for why I am alone. I don't need a reason. I don't need to explain myself. I am not just the reflection that other people happen to see. And in order to appreciate that, I need to learn to be quiet. So solitude can help us grasp that value, can help us quiet the voices in our head, and help us reduce this need to see ourselves through other people. I don't think it can be eliminated, but reduce that need to see ourselves through other people. Solitude then can be a good way to prepare us to come back into social life. When I return from contemplation, from having, thought about the nature of the universe, about whatever I happen to be looking at, art or anything like this, I can come back and know that as I said before, I always transcend myself. I can know that I'm always more than what I have done, than what I have been, than what other people need me to be, than what I have been so far, right? In that way, I always can choose to be more or different. I may not be able to justify all of those answers, like to lay out full reasons for them. That's okay. I can be who I am. It's not that I come back with unshakable knowledge of some kind, right? It's like I've gone off into the woods and got revelation, and they tell me this is who you are and how you're supposed to be and the way that's not true either, right? I could be wrong. I could be mistaken. Even, contemplating the universe, I can get things terribly wrong. What I've learned is to hear others' voices for what they are. They can be heard not as me, right? As parts of me, as commentaries on me, as integrated into me. They can be the independent entities that they are. So that's what I find a particular value from quietness, from being alone, is that it gives me the clarity to listen, to hear what other people are actually saying, and not be sort of so involved that I can't actually see it. It's centering to spend some time in solitude. It's centering to be alone long enough to quiet the voices of other people that bounce around in your head and really come to rest, not in answers, but just in not having that conversation anymore. And I think that really does help us be social creatures, because we can return to social life a little less needy, a little more centered in ourselves, a little more ready to listen to each other. All right. And with that, I will stop the recording.